Good morning. We're going to talk a little bit about Holy Wednesday today. So this week we are in the last week of Jesus's life on earth. And each year during the Easter time, many families celebrate Holy Week or Passion Week. So this morning I've printed up a ton of information, and I wanted to kind of cover what's going on and what's Holy Week and what's going on Holy Wednesday, and why when you drive around, if you take drives in your car because you can't go anywhere else, why are you seeing red ribbons over doorposts? What is the red ribbon? What does that mean? And why is it hanging over the doors? And you hear about kind of Passover, and you know that's associated with Easter, but what does that all really mean? I want to take some time and talk about how did we get to Passover and what was going on in Israel, in the Israelites' life for Passover, and what in the world happened? Why were they slaves? How did they get out of the slavery situation? And so I want to give a little background first on what was going on. And so this morning when we talk about Passover, we're going to cover, I'm going to start, you can read in Exodus starting in chapter 7, and we're going to kind of get through, I think, chapter 14. And so I'm going to kind of summarize a lot of what you read in the Old Testament. And I know a lot of people have said, oh, that Old Testament's boring and I don't understand it. Well, I hope this morning to give you a little insight and understanding what was going on at that time and what Passover is all about. Because today is in Holy Week, it is Holy Wednesday. This evening, many families, Jewish families in particular, will be celebrating Passover and the Passover feast. So let's talk quickly about what happened with the Israelites. So we were talking, somebody asked, well, what's hanging on the doors? What is the red ribbon? What does that mean? And really that's symbolic of blood. So Egypt, back thousands of years ago, there were many Israelites or Jews in Egypt. And at that time, there was a very hateful king, King Pharaoh, who was in charge of all of Egypt. And during that time, the Jews, and we'll call them Israelites, but the Jews began to multiply, so much so that Pharaoh was a little concerned about being overthrown in his role. So he made them all slaves. They worked day and night. They made bricks. They built cities. They built buildings. And they began to be discontent because they didn't get rest, and they worked nonstop. And so they cried out to God to save them, and God sent them Moses. And many of you know that Moses ends up leading the Israelites through their 40 years of wandering in the desert. And this is kind of where we pick up. And I've got so many notes, so I need to read. But at the time that God had anointed Moses to be the leader of the Israelites, Moses was required to go to the Pharaoh and request the release of the Israelites. And if you know Moses, one, he stuttered, so he didn't feel like he was even equipped to do this, to approach the king of a nation. However, he did, because God told him he would. And so Moses approaches Pharaoh and requests the release of the Israelites. And Pharaoh says there's no way. He refuses, and Moses warns him at that time that there would be many plagues that would hit the land of Egypt. And at this point, Pharaoh didn't budge and wouldn't release the Israelites. So this is kind of where we're going to get to the plagues. At that time, Moses then warns Pharaoh. He says, God is going to send plagues on the land of Egypt until you release the Israelites. What you need to know is that there were plagues, many plagues. There were plagues where, let me read about them because I don't have them all memorized. So the first plague was water was turned to blood. In Egypt, when water was turned to blood, finally the Pharaoh said, okay, I'm going to let these Israelites go. But then as the Israelites began to leave Egypt, he changed his mind. This goes on 9 different times. Finally, the last plague, which is the plague on the firstborn, which is what the red is all about. We're going to get to this. The 10th plague is what eventually leads not only Pharaoh, but the Egyptians to force the Israelites out of Egypt and out of slavery. So let me read about the 10th plague so that we better understand what the red is hanging on the doors and why that's important today to Passover. It says the 10th plague, the plague on the firstborn. An avenging angel would go from house to house, killing every firstborn son. Israelite children would not be killed. Remember, Israelites are our Jews in the story. Israelite children would not be killed, and thus God would show that they were his chosen people. And we do know that the Jewish people are God's chosen people. So that the angel would know which houses were Israelite, Jewish homes, the Israelite homes, the children of Israel were to follow very specific instructions. Each household was to take an unblemished male lamb, which, guys, this is foreshadowing of Jesus. An unblemished male lamb, look after it, and slaughter it at twilight 4 days later. It's very interesting because in Jewish tradition, the lamb was to be chosen and held for 5 days. On the 5th day, the lamb was sacrificed. And we're going to see that how that applies to when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem in Holy Week. So the blood from the lamb was to be brushed on the door frames, and this would tell the angel that it was an Israelite home and that it should pass over the home and not kill the firstborn. Interestingly enough, at midnight, when the angel arrives, and this is in the Old Testament, when the angel arrives, every Egyptian firstborn, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh, the king, to the firstborn of the prisoner in his cell, and even the livestock were struck down by the angel. And what we find here at this point, Egyptians are terrified. Hi guys, if you're joining me, Nancy, Kristen, April, good morning. Hi Cindy and Connie, talking about the Passover, Holy Wednesday, and what's going on with all these red ribbons and red stuff above people's doorposts. It's symbolic today of the blood from the lamb that was on the door frames of the Israelites when the Passover angel passed over these homes. So Egyptians lost the firstborn of everything, their livestock, their homes, including the King Pharaoh, who would not let the Israelites go until this 10th plague hit. The Egyptians at that time were terrified. They were so terrified that not only did they force the Israelites out, they actually gave them gold and silver. And at that time, the Israelites only had, let me find it on my paper, the Israelites took their unleavened dough with them. They didn't have time to add the yeast, which allowed the bread to rise. And so this is where we get matzah, our unleavened bread, which is kind of a cool little history. But then, once the people had traveled, the Israelites had traveled not far, army to come after them. Interestingly enough, Pharaoh just hadn't learned in his 10 plagues at this point. But Pharaoh chased after the Israelites, and the Jews, they dashed forward. The Israelites dashed forward and reached a large sea. So this is where we see the parting of the Red Sea. All of this is so fascinating. The sea was too big to swim across. I'm reading this from some of my notes here. It's too big to swim across. They were frightened that Pharaoh's men would soon reach them, and the people prayed to God, and a miracle occurred. This is kind of one of my favorite verses in Exodus, and this is Moses speaking to the Israelites right as they are approaching the Red Sea with the big Egyptian army behind them. All of Pharaoh's army, by the way. Exodus 14:14, Moses says to the Israelites, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." I'm going to stop here because I think this is something that we can all cling to. We've got lots going on, things that we don't have control over. Some of us are frightened and dealing with anxiety. We don't understand what's going on and we don't know what's to come. And I want to encourage you. Exodus 14:14 says, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." So our eyes are on God. We keep our eyes on God during this time, just like the Israelites had to do when Pharaoh's army was chasing them up until the Red Sea, where at this time, God tells Moses, "Lift your staff and stretch your arm out across the sea, and the sea will part, and the Israelites will be able to go across on dry land. If you read this is Exodus 14, you'll see that not only do the Israelites get to go across dry land through the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, an amazing miracle, but as soon as they are done crossing, God tells Moses, stretch his hand out again over the sea, and the sea walls fall back together and drown Pharaoh's army. So many of you may be asking, well, how could they be so frightened? I will tell you that if you were being chased by an army, the largest army in the world at the time, it would be frightening. But know that it's estimated that over 2.4 million Israelites were able to get out of slavery, out of Egypt. So let me get to Passover. Passover, we talked about, what does Passover? Passover is when the angel of death passed over the Jews' homes who had blood from an unblemished lamb on the doorpost. That's what the red ribbons are around town when you're driving around. You see red over the doorpost. It's important to also note that the Bible tells us that Jesus is our sacrificial lamb. And I'm going to read a little bit. The Passover lamb was to be a male without defect. As we know, Jesus is the only perfect man to have ever lived, a man without defect. When the Passover lamb was roasted and eaten, none of its bones were broken. So when Jesus was sacrificed, not one of his bones was broken, even though it was customary during crucifixion to break the leg bones of the person after a few hours in order to quicken their death by suffocation. Okay, I'm going to move on to the importance of the customs because I don't want to give this all away. Tomorrow we'll talk about Maundy, Thursday. But right now, let's talk about the Jewish customs during Jesus' time. It's important to better understand the symbolism of Jesus' last week. 5 days before the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed, it was selected for the sacrifice. Watch this. Jesus came into the city of Jerusalem 5 days. 5 days, guys, before the lamb was killed in the temple as the Passover sacrifice for the sins of the people of Israel. It's really interesting, and I don't want to go too far beyond the fact that we were talking about what's the red over the doorpost and what does the Passover mean and what's important. Tomorrow we're going to pick up in John 13, verses 1 through 11, and Mark 14, 12 through 26, where we'll talk about Maundy, Thursday, and Passion Week. We're going to see Jesus wash the disciples' feet and eat the Passover, the Last Supper. If you want to read ahead, go ahead. In the meantime, think about the sacrifices that were made. Remember that Jesus is our sacrificial lamb, that he was unblemished. If you want to study a little bit more about this, you can look up Jewish traditions and Jewish history over the Passover and learn some fascinating history that goes back thousands of years, and the fact that the Passover, the feast of the Passover, is celebrated even today. So tonight around 8 p.m., the Passover feast will begin to be celebrated in many homes across the world, and I want you to know what that was all about. So I hope that was helpful. Exodus 14:14, if you didn't hear it earlier, a promise that God gave the Israelites that we cling to today, that God will fight our battles for us. That applies to us right now, today. I pray you're blessed. I will see you sometime tomorrow, and we'll be talking about Maundy, Thursday. Thanks for joining me, guys. Thanks for all of your support. We'll catch up soon.